When Major General George McClellan took command of the Union Army, he devised a plan to move on Richmond by water. A fleet of ships would move his army down the Chesapeake Bay to the Virginia coast, where it would advance up one of the peninsulas toward the Confederate capital. But the appearance of a single warship in Hampton Roads threatened to stop this campaign before it could begin. Confederate shipbuilders had reconfigured the burned-out hull of the steam frigate Merrimac, turning it into an ironclad vessel rechristened the CSS Virginia. The Virginia set out on the morning of March 8, 1862, under command of Captain Franklin Buchanan. After opening fire on the Union's 41-gun frigate Congress, Buchanan steered a course for the frigate Cumberland, which he rammed and sent to the bottom with 121 men. The Virginia then turned its attention to the Congress, which had run aground, and shelled it until the Congress struck its flag. When Union shore batteries continued their shelling of the Virginia, despite the surrender, Buchanan continued to hammer away at the defenseless Congress, blowing it up with a loss of 120 men. The Union steam frigate Minnesota entered the fray, but also ran aground. As dusk approached, the Virginia retired to Sewell's Point, with the intention of finishing off the Minnesota the next day. But the next day, March 9, 1862, changed the history of naval warfare. When the Virginia sailed into Hampton Roads on the morning of March 9th, it confronted a so-called cheese box on a raft, the Monitor, under the command of Lieutenant John Worden. For 3.5 hours, the two ironclads fired on one another at close range. Shells bounced harmlessly off the armor plating of both ships. At 12:15 p.m., as the Monitor temporarily moved to shallow waters, the Virginia withdrew. Though the first encounter between ironclads was a draw, the Monitor's presence meant the Union Navy could remain in Hampton Roads and McClellan's Peninsula campaign could proceed. Despite that tactical victory, McClellan's campaign failed. Later that year, as Norfolk fell, the Virginia's crew destroyed the ship rather than let it fall into Union hands. On December 31st, the Monitor sank in a storm off Cape Hatteras. Though both the Virginia and the Monitor passed quickly from the scene, their impact on naval warfare was lasting. An eyewitness reporter from the New York Herald crowed, "Our late sea fight in Hampton Roads is one of the most remarkable and instructive events in the history of modern warfare. It establishes the utter uselessness of wooden ships." This mini-series video is brought to you by Navy Federal Credit Union. By early 1945, victory in numerous Pacific battles had brought the U.S. Navy to Japan's doorstep. Army Air Force B-29 Super Fortress bombers began flying from the Mariana Islands on 1,200-mile round-trip bombing missions against the Japanese home islands. But enemy fighters based on Iwo Jima, an 8-square-mile volcanic island on the route to Japan, regularly attacked the American bombers, and damaged U.S. planes had no place for emergency landing. Allied leaders decided that Navy amphibious forces had to seize Iwo Jima to eliminate the enemy fighter base and to develop an airstrip for cripple bombers to use. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, was directed to carry out the critical operation. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions of Marine Major General Harry Schmidt's 5th Amphibious Corps made up the assault force. Iwo Jima was defended by Lieutenant General Kuribayashi Tadamichi and 21,000 men, who were ordered not only to fight to the death, but to kill 10 American Marines as they did so. Army, Navy, and Marine Corps planes bombed Iwo Jima for months before the landing, and Navy battleships, cruisers, and destroyers shelled the island for 3 days, But this fire was still not enough. Naval amphibious craft under Admiral Harry W. Hill put the Marines ashore on the morning of February 15, 1945, and the men were immediately hit by a storm of fire from dug-in Japanese defenders. Enemy gunners entrenched on Mount Suribachi, which dominated the landing beaches on the southern tip of the island, pounded the exposed Marines and amphibious vessels with relentless artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire. Bombardment from U.S. warships off the coast destroyed some Japanese bunkers and artillery positions, but enemy underground fortifications proved hard to neutralize. Despite continued fierce Japanese opposition, by nightfall the Navy had deployed 30,000 Marines ashore, and these men were determined to stay there. The Marines went to work using grenades, satchel charges, and flamethrowers to destroy enemy fortifications in their path. Fire control parties operating with the troops on the beach called in heavy, continuous, and direct fire on the enemy from Navy warships offshore. Little by little, the men of the American Arms Team began to work their way inland. On February 23rd, one Marine patrol fought its way to the top of Mount Suribachi and raised Old Glory, immediately boosting morale of Marines fighting below and sailors on ships offshore. When the men replaced this flag with another larger flag, Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal snapped the picture that would become the most recognized symbol of Marine Corps valor and determination. Despite the important victory, the fighting to seize Iwo Jima raged on for another month. All but 216 of the defenders fought to the death. American losses were also high. Over 6,000 Marines, sailors, and Coast Guardsmen were killed, and another 17,000 wounded. With Iwo Jima now in American hands, Army Air Force fighters based there began protecting the B-29s on their long missions to and from Japan. Even more important, by the end of the war, 2,251 shot-up bombers and their crews were able to make emergency landings on the island. The seizure of Iwo Jima in support of the bombing campaign proved vital to ending the bloody war in the Pacific in 1945. This mini-series video is brought to you by Navy Federal Credit Union. The Cold War had turned particularly frigid by October 1962. There was tension between the Soviets and Americans throughout the world, including right in America's backyard, in the Caribbean. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev tried to gain a military advantage over the United States by secretly shipping nuclear-capable ballistic missiles and bombers to the island of Cuba under the control of communist dictator Fidel Castro. On October 16th, the CIA informed President John F. Kennedy that high-altitude U-2 spy planes had discovered the construction of Soviet missile launching pads being set up in the interior of Cuba. Navy Crusader jets flying dangerous low-level reconnaissance over Cuba confirmed the presence of these weapons of mass destruction. Kennedy's top advisors debated various courses of action, which included accepting the presence of missiles in Cuba or launching airstrikes and an amphibious invasion to remove them. Kennedy concluded that he could not allow the Soviets to keep the threatening missiles and bombers in Cuba only 90 miles from Florida. At the same time, he did not want to trigger World War III by attacking Soviet forces. So Kennedy settled on a third option. He directed the U.S. Navy to stop the transport of missiles and bombers to Cuba with a quarantine, another way of saying a blockade. If the Soviets refused to stop their merchant ships for inspection or tried to ignore the American blockade, they would be responsible for the consequences. Kennedy turned to Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral George W. Anderson, and gave him the critical mission. "It looks like this is up to the Navy," Kennedy said. "Mr. President, the Navy will not let you down," Anderson replied. As the Navy deployed warships into the Caribbean, The White House announced on October 22nd that the president would address the nation that evening. The world held its breath.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
The quarantine operation was assigned to Vice Admiral Alfred Ward, commander of the Second Fleet, under the direction of Admiral Robert Dennison, commander-in-chief of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. Soon, aircraft carriers Enterprise and Independence, along with other warships, took up positions in the eastern Caribbean. American destroyers deployed to waters northeast of Cuba and established a quarantine line beyond the range of potentially hostile aircraft. Simultaneously, the U.S. Navy's shore-based planes patrolled the Atlantic Ocean looking for Soviet ships. Supported by cruisers, American destroyers set up patrol areas 60 miles apart along the quarantine line. Boarding parties from the USS Joseph P. Kennedy and other destroyers stopped and searched non-Soviet merchant ships. After several tense days, all Soviet ships reversed course and headed for home before reaching the American quarantine line. The Soviets had blinked.
This is Radio Moscow. Premier Khrushchev has sent a message to President Kennedy today. The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
With American determination now clear, Khrushchev communicated to Kennedy that he would remove offensive weapons from Cuba if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. By the end of November, Atlantic Fleet surface ships and reconnaissance planes verified that Soviet merchant ships were heading from Cuba to the USSR, their decks loaded with missiles and bombers. The Navy had successfully accomplished the mission assigned by the president without having to fire a shot. Since the birth of the U.S. Navy, American sailors have often risked and sometimes sacrificed their lives to keep their ship in the fight. During the War of 1812, USS Chesapeake, under the command of Captain James Lawrence, joined battle with the British frigate Shannon off Boston. In the furious close-quarters action, Lawrence was mortally wounded. As the men carried their captain to his cabin, Lawrence gave the now famous command, "Don't give up the ship." The British captured Chesapeake, but Lawrence's words were not lost on his fellow sailors, especially the young American captain, Oliver Hazard Perry. Perry had a flag made that was emblazoned with Lawrence's dying words. Perry used the flag to inspire his men to victory during the War of 1812 Battle of Lake Erie. Over the next 200 years, the saying, "Don't give up the ship," would become well known to the sailors of the U.S. Navy, whose naval vessels braved both harsh seas and deadly enemy fire. In the closing days of World War II, Japanese bombs turned the carrier USS Franklin into a raging inferno that killed or wounded 1,000 of her 3,450-man crew and threatened to sink the ship. After sustaining massive damage from fire and explosion, the Franklin was in real danger of going down. Even though the ship lay dead in the water and listing to starboard only 50 miles off the coast of Japan, her crew refused to abandon their ship to the waves. Franklin's men manned pumps and hoses, shored up weakened bulkheads, cared for the wounded and dying, and worked to rescue shipmates trapped below decks. Through heroic efforts, the men of USS Franklin saved their ship and brought her safely home to America. More than 2 decades later, in July 1967, the carrier USS Forrestal was steaming in the Gulf of Tonkin and launching airstrikes against targets in North Vietnam. Suddenly, a carrier sailor's worst nightmare, fire at sea, became a reality. A rocket attached to the wing of an F-4 Phantom fighter bomber was accidentally triggered. The weapon smashed into other planes loaded with fuel and ammunition. In seconds, the flight deck was engulfed in smoke and flame. Explosions from bombs and rockets scattered debris the length of the carrier and blew a huge hole in the deck that extended deep into the ship. Even after seeing one damage control team after another being laid low by fiery blast, Forrestal's men pitched in and fought the fire for the next 8 hours. Despite the loss of 134 shipmates, Forrestal's valiant crewmen kept their ship afloat. After extensive repairs, the carrier returned to the fleet. In addition to serving as a demonstration of selfless courage and sacrifice at sea, the Forrestal fire provided later generations of sailors with valuable lessons on the do's and don'ts of damage control. In April 1988, the guided missile frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts struck a mine as the warship operated in the dangerous waters of the Persian Gulf. The blast, 4 feet from the keel on the port side of the hull, created a huge 15 by 20-foot hole.
The story that has unfolded here, I believe, in the last 30 hours has been a story of a ship that refused to die, of a crew that is well-trained and well-disciplined, that has tremendous pride and tremendous spirit.
The violence of the explosion knocked the ship's main engines off their foundations and nearly broke the vessel in half. In spite of the serious damage, her crew went into action, using all the knowledge and skill they had acquired in damage control training and exercises. The men of Samuel B. Roberts kept their ship in operation to fight again another day. In October 2000, American sailors once again found themselves in harm's way in the volatile Middle East. Al-Qaeda terrorists brought a small boat packed with explosives close alongside USS Cole, then taking on fuel in the port of Aden, Yemen, and then detonated it. The blast blew a massive hole in the port side of the Aegis guided missile destroyer, killing 17 sailors and injuring 39 others. Almost immediately, in darkened, heavily damaged, and water-filled compartments, the men and women of USS Cole came to the aid of their injured shipmates and teamed up to save their ship. Having gone through damage control drills every day during the ship's transit from the United States, these sailors were ready for the challenge. After stateside repairs, USS Cole rejoined the U.S. Atlantic Fleet and is once again at sea, helping to defend the nation. Since the early days of the United States Navy, our sailors have been ever mindful of Captain James Lawrence's dying words, "Don't give up the ship." April 1914, Veracruz. During a short conflict with Mexican forces, Chief Boatswain's Mate John McCloy realizes that fellow sailors ashore are under attack. He leads 3 picket launches along the waterfront to draw enemy fire. His boats are hit and McCloy is wounded, but his daring act saves other American fighting men. McCloy is awarded the Medal of Honor, but it is not his first. 14 years earlier, he led a landing party to assist the relief expedition of the Allied forces in China and was recognized with his nation's highest military honor. December 1941, Pearl Harbor. Enemy torpedo planes and dive bombers severely damaged the moored battleship USS Nevada. Her crewmen realized they need to get their ship underway and out to sea. Seizing the initiative, Chief Warrant Officer Edwin Joseph Hill and his men dive into the water and swim ashore. In a hail of bombs and machine gun fire, they cast off lines from shoreside strongpoints and swim back to the ship. Hill then races to the forecastle, fully exposed to Japanese fire, to free the battleship's huge forward anchor. He is there when an enemy bomb explodes, blowing him over the side and killing him. For these acts of bravery, Chief Warrant Officer Hill is posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. That same day, Mess Attendant Second Class Dory Miller is on a battleship, USS West Virginia. When general quarters is sounded, Miller rushes to his post in an ammunition magazine, but finds it wrecked from a Japanese torpedo explosion. He then makes his way to the bridge, where he cares for the mortally wounded captain of the ship. Finally, Miller mans a .50 caliber machine gun, and even though he is not trained in its use, fires at attacking enemy aircraft that are bombing and strafing his ship. Only when his ammunition runs out and the officer in charge orders abandon ship does Miller leave his post. For such distinguished devotion to duty and extraordinary courage, Dory Miller is awarded the Navy Cross. The brave sailor makes the ultimate sacrifice for his country later in the war when the escort carrier USS Lipscomb Bay is sunk by a Japanese submarine. 4 September 1943, Lae, New Guinea. As Allied forces advanced through the Solomon Islands, a U.S. tank landing ship, LST-473, is attacked by Japanese aircraft. Suddenly, enemy bombs hit the ship, killing and wounding many sailors and engulfing the bridge in flames. The helmsman is knocked from his wheel. Just then, Japanese torpedoes are spotted heading for the vessel. Even though mortally wounded, Seaman First Class Johnny David Hutchins, a naval reservist, grabs the wheel and steers the ship clear of the closing torpedoes. For saving his ship and his shipmates at the cost of his life, Seaman First Class Johnny David Hutchins receives the Medal of Honor. 25 October 1944, Battle of Leyte Gulf. A powerful armada of Japanese battleships, cruisers, and destroyers bears down on the vulnerable U.S. invasion force. To prevent destruction of the landing ships, American naval leaders sent several smaller warships, including destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, against the onrushing enemy. One of Samuel B. Roberts' bluejackets, gunner's mate third class Paul Henry Carr, operates his weapon skillfully, putting many rounds into the attackers. He stays at his post even after sustaining mortal wounds. Even though Samuel B. Roberts and 2 American destroyers are sunk in this desperate action, they compel the Japanese admiral to withdraw from the area. Through their courage and self-sacrifice, Petty Officer Carr and his fellow sailors help save the day. For his courage and devotion to duty, Carr is awarded the Silver Star. 6 March 1967, Mekong River, Republic of Vietnam. Another American sailor shows the right stuff. Seaman David G. Willett, the forward machine gunner on PBR-124, is on patrol in the Mekong Delta area of South Vietnam. As the boat moves along a narrow waterway surrounded by dense jungle foliage, a grenade comes out of nowhere and lands on the vessel. Willett immediately leaves his covered position, shouts a warning, and races the length of the boat to push the captain out of harm's way and take the full blast of the enemy grenade. For his extraordinary act of heroism and self-sacrifice, the young seaman is awarded the Medal of Honor. Throughout our history, U.S. Navy enlisted sailors have stepped forward, often at the risk of their lives, to serve their nation, their Navy, and their shipmates.